Hi, everybody. I want to go ahead and get us started today. So I want to welcome everyone to this ABSA webinar, Strategies for Teaching the Insurrection and Impeachment. My name is Emily Ferris, and I'm an Associate Professor of Political Science and Core Faculty in Comparative Race and Ethnic Studies at TCU. We've organized this panel of experts in American politics and racial and ethnic politics today to help all of us develop our teaching in response to recent events with the white supremacist attack on the American Capitol and former President Trump's second impeachment. So I first want to thank everyone for joining us today, of giving your time and energy in the midst of all the challenges going on right now, and thank Tanya and Bennett at ABSA for their help organizing and supporting this webinar. As an ABSA webinar, we'll follow their Respect campaign, which encourages professional respect by and towards all participants and attendees. Respect stands for respectful, equitable, safe, professional, and ethical conduct towards all, and you can learn more about it on their website. I'm interested today in learning how we as political scientists can seek to understand our place in the classroom during this contemporary crisis, which is a product of the longstanding histories in American politics of colonialism, imperialism, racism, and white supremacy. How can we teach these events in a way that helps our students understand that violence and systemic injustices operate under a cover of US democracy, as well as prepare for any potential for backlash in teaching these topics, particularly for those who are in more vulnerable positions in the classroom? I've invited scholars of racial and ethnic politics to guide us and contribute their expertise in navigating these challenges, and I'd like to welcome and introduce them now. Dr. Benjamin is an associate professor in the Clara Luper Department of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. She researches and teaches race and politics and urban politics, looking at local elections and voting behavior. Dr. Silva is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and affiliated faculty in Latina, Latino, and Mexican American Studies at the University of North Texas. She researches and teaches Latino politics, US immigration politics, and political representation. Dr. Phoenix is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at UC Irvine. He studies and teaches Black politics, political behavior, urban politics, political communication, and political psychology. And Dr. Jardina is an assistant professor of political science at Duke University. She writes and teaches on group identities, social movements, political psychology, race, and racial attitudes. To get us started, I'll have a few questions that I'm going to pose to our panelists and invite each of them to respond. We will save lots of time at the end for audience questions, so please submit those to us via the Q&A on your screen. So to start, I'd like just to start by asking the panelists for them to briefly describe their classroom spaces, so we get a kind of an understanding of what kind of classes and what students you teach, and how just in general current events typically play a role in your classes. So I'll open that up to the panelists. If Dr. Silva, you'll get us started.
Hey everybody. I'm an assistant professor at UNT. This is my I can't remember because of COVID, like my 4th or 5th year. UNT is a large state school. It has 40,000 students. It was in North Texas, so we're about 40 minutes north of Dallas. So we get a lot of students from the DFW metro area. We were recently designated an HSI. A Hispanic serving institution. And most of my students are first generation, middle class, lower middle class, Latino, white, Black students, right? I teach, like Emily said, I teach intro to American politics, like the actual intro, like welcome, right? Immigration politics and American political economy of race, ethnicity, and migration. And I typically insert current events in every class, right? Because I think just like Emily mentioned, this isn't, as far as I'm concerned, this really is like just the latest iteration of something that's been happening for a very long time. And so if I can show that continuity in current events, it's actually really, I think it's really beneficial for students.
Sorry, y'all can jump in whenever. I can call on y'all like my students too, but we could just, y'all can jump in too.
I'll tag Ashley then.
Okay, there we go.
Thanks, Andrea. I just want to take a quick second to shout out to Emily for putting this together and taking the initiative to provide this awesome public good. So thank you for doing that. I teach courses I'm at Duke University, so I teach mainly about race and racism, and often to a fairly diverse group of students in terms of their racial and ethnic identities, although perhaps at a place like Duke, not necessarily especially diverse in terms of their socioeconomic backgrounds. My classes typically had fewer than 50 students in them, and the way I run my classes is I pair lectures with significant discussion, and I use Slack, and I do that in class as well. And so got a slightly different population of students, but my students tend to be, like most college students, ideologically fairly liberal, but I also have a significant number of more conservative students who take my classes. And I'll tag Andrea Benjamin.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, Emily, thank you so much for organizing this and including me in this. So I am in an African and African American Studies department, but I still teach classes that are pretty political. So this semester I'm teaching politics and public policy, which the Black is implied there. That might be important later. And then I'm also teaching the Black athlete in America, which I teach from a very activist athlete perspective. And so it's basically political science as through the lens of sport. And so, it is, my students are pretty diverse, but obviously they are also extremely Black, which is very exciting for me. And, OU is a public institution. There's about 30,000 students. Our major isn't huge. And so our classes are usually capped at 30. But right now during the panoramic, as it were, they're capped at 25 online. So they're just not that big, which is great. And like Ashley, I use a lot of discussion. I expect them to talk. And so for me, current events are, I tell them all the time that I would send you 50 emails a day, but I know that's abusive. So I try to condense things, but they have to bring in outside resources when they lead discussion. It has to be an op-ed. It has to be something related to the topic. So constantly, I think we're just responding to the news, and especially the last 10 months, I think for both of those classes, I could pick something every day from the front page of a newspaper and it would be applicable to our class. So we talk about current events all the time. And I'm going to tag Dr. Phoenix because he's last.
Thanks, everyone. Really glad to be here. Gosh, I would really love to take that Black athletes class. So I, at UCI, am also at a pretty large, it's R1 school. It's got 60% of the students are first gen. It's got a pretty non-trivial international student population, primarily from East Asia. I gotta check my notes so I don't go over time. It is an Asian serving institution. I think a couple of years ago became a Hispanic or Latinx serving institution. And that diversity is reflected in my courses. At the undergrad level, I teach the large Intro to Race and Ethnicity course, which is about 250 students. Wide subsection of students, cross-section, I should say, since that's a general requirement. At the upper division level, I typically teach a Black politics course and a medium politics course. Those range from about 80 to 100 students. And at the grad level, teach the American Field Seminar and a course on race, ethnicity, and gender. And similarly, I try to weave in current events. I feel like it's impossible to not talk about current events. Oftentimes, it's just kind of within the conversation I'm trying to weave in. Like I've been making some GameStop references this past couple of weeks, but sometimes I feel the need to, and I'm sure other panelists have to kind of completely disrupt the course content and create some slides to accommodate things that I think we need to talk about this kind of directly and be able to contextualize it, connect it to the ideas we've been discussing and connect it to a broader history so people understand this isn't an isolated event. So yeah, that's the dynamics I'm working with.
Great, thanks everybody. One of the reasons why I was so excited for all of you to join us today is because you do teach a pretty wide array of different types of classes and different within the field of race and ethnic politics, but also have different classroom experiences in different settings. And so I hope that people in the audience can connect maybe to different panelists and think about how this might work in a smaller class or a larger class or in a class with primarily students of color or a more diverse ideological class, all the differences. So I want to go ahead and jump into the issue at hand and ask you all how you're interpreting this insurrection and impeachment, these events, and how either you're planning on bringing them into your classes or maybe ways that you already have brought them into your classrooms. So Dr. Benjamin, will you start us off today?
Sure. So I probably don't have the best story. I mean, we didn't start classes until last week, so I think we had a little bit more time than other people who had started sooner to think about it. But as I mentioned, both of my classes I talk about protest all the time. I'm sure the students think I'm some radical person that spends every Saturday and Sunday in the streets complaining and protesting about something. And so I felt like, even though it was the first day of class, I didn't know these students. I really had to gamble and just say, we have to talk about it because we are going to spend the next 16 weeks. And every week I'm going to tell you a way that in history, Black people have used protests to do X, Y, and Z, or in our current climate, athletes are using protests to obtain X or to, move X, Y, and Z forward. And so I really want to make sure that we understand what happened on January 6th and what protest is. And so we had a really long and hard conversation again, first day of class. I went through my normal stuff and then I said, hey, let's talk about this. Luckily, the students, went for it. But not everyone was pleased, I will say that, and I heard about it. So, but I wanted them to sort of think about that for themselves. And one of the things that we talked about in both classes was, what if people were, people can be dissatisfied with the election and they had options that were not what happened. And so what would it have looked like if they had done those things was a really big part of the conversation. I did shy away from trying to compare it to other protest movements, if only because I think that's really unfair to those protest movements and that the context is much more nuanced. And I wanted, we can move forward towards that. But just for that first day, I wanted to make sure that they knew, that I'm a professor, that we're going to talk about these things. And even if, I don't want to change your mind, but we're going to talk about them respectfully and we are going to engage with it because it's part of where we're trying to go, which is eventually in both classes, our quest for universal freedom for African Americans, which is the theme that runs through both courses. So I'm supposed to tag someone. Ashley, I'll tag you.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, I think that your point, Andrea, about sort of the timing of these things is really well taken. And that part of, I think, being able to teach on hard topics is about developing a rapport with our students. And it's really hard to jump into something in the beginning of the semester. So that poses its own unique challenge that maybe we can talk about. But sort of more generally, I'd say I interpret the insurrection and impeachment as a symptom of serious the erosion of democratic norms. And in both my research and what I teach, the lens through which I view these events is that the insurrection and the Trump presidency more broadly are in part the result of a lot of racial hostility that many white Americans have in the United States, and also the fact that many whites view the increasing diversity in the United States as threats to their group's status and power and privileges. And so I integrate a lot of the research that I do into the conversation about these current events and about a broader conversation that has to do with white supremacy in the United States. And I talk a lot about the contemporary research on white racial attitudes. And I think, of course, this conversation is also really relevant to research on polarization and conspiracy theories and misinformation and efforts to restrict voting access. So all of these things that are really important topics in political science become part of the way in which we interpret these particular events. And Andrea, I'll tag you next.
Thank you. Yeah, so I interpret these events as evidence of a much larger and ingrained problem of violent white supremacy, right, in my class. Like, that's kind of how I discuss it. It's been, we minimize it, we ignore it, right, and yet it keeps popping up, right? And so this, like, it's just one more example for me of the violent white supremacy that, non-white people have experienced in the United States, right? So I go in my APE class, in my Intro to American Politics class, like, I talk about disenfranchisement, I talk about genocide of Indigenous Americans, like, I talk about all of those things. Much more violent stories, right, of like genocide, enslavement, murder, economic swindling en masse, right, all justified and vindicated under the guise of like America for like particular Americans, right? And so this is really nothing new for us in our history, but the big difference is that it's on live television, right? Now it's on like live television, so we're all seeing it, and there's really no way to deny that, this is what's happening, right? Specifically, in my immigration class, this is the last chapter, the last example of a long history of immigration policy being rooted in white supremacy, in racist and nativist legislation, right? So like in my class, I teach that like the race policies that we have in America inform the immigration policy that we spread to who can come to the United States, right? And I take a point to talk about nativism, right? It's really very important to talk about nativism when you're talking about American immigration policy. And the iterations of nativism going through the KKK, and how this is really just an extension of all of this stuff that's happening, right? Like, I hate, maybe I'm just the cynical person, but like there have been a lot worse cases, right? Like as far as like violence is concerned, like race riots, religious riots, nativist riots, lynchings, you know, this is just like one more thing that happened. The only thing is like it happened with a bunch of like rich white people, white presenting people. Devin?
Yeah, so a lot of what everyone said resonated, particularly the challenge of trying to walk students through this when you haven't had a chance to get to know them very well. So we're in a quarter system and we started a little early. So this is week 5 for me. Week 1 was Capitol Siege week. So I'm teaching Black Politics Tuesday, Thursday. Tuesday, I'm showing that classic image of the Black man being attacked with an American flag by a white racist, and talking about kind of the history of violence against Black people and Black movements, and saying we're on the precipice of violence. And then I came back on Thursday and I said I didn't mean the next day, we're on the precipice of violence. And so I think, to echo what's been said, I had to be very upfront and explicit about the challenge of having the conversation that we're about to have on day 2 without building up any trust and rapport. And I do try to, as a general rule, pull back the curtain a little bit and talk about the process of teaching and my strategy, and how this isn't the only way to go about this. This is how I'm choosing to do it, but think about why I'm doing it this way. And I said, you know, it's really difficult. I like to have the difficult conversations. It's all difficult, but the really intensive conversations after we've got to build up some trust within each other. And already that's difficult to do in an online space. But we had to do this on day 2 now. So I tried to role model by first sharing a little bit about how I was processing this literally in real time. And I tried to, before I got into what can we learn from this, how are we feeling our way through this? Because I think, you know, trying to engage them emotionally would help them engage analytically. And so I think that did a decent job opening up some conversation, and people shared. What was important for me wasn't just to give them some space to process, but to understand the frames of reference they were using as a starting point, to understand how to kind of shape the context I wanted to draw from this moment in time. And one thing that was really striking was the number of students that aren't in abstract thinking about what this would have been like if this was people of color, but people that were active as participants and leaders in protests during the summer in their local communities, talking about guns being drawn on them, talking about violent confrontations with police, talking about, so we as the people of color identifying the white allies to be shields. This isn't like conceptual for them. This is real. This is raw. And so there's a real raw, palpable emotion thinking about their place, not only as students, but as like participants and leaders of change, seeing how the state treats them versus how it treats people fundamentally, diametrically opposed to them. So I'm really glad I was able to try to create that space and be honest about why we needed it and why it wasn't ideal, but necessary to do. And then I tried to, as the other folks are saying, provide some context, understand this isn't by any means new. This is just another manifestation, but also try to switch the narrative a little bit so that I'm not just centering the aggressors and the insurrectionists, but centering the people of color that are allegedly making these gains. So we walk through, look at some overtime trends for Black people specifically, overtime trends in median income, median wealth, unemployment, people living under the poverty line, housing insecurity, arrest rates, incarceration rates. And it's like all of these gains that are being made aren't realized in any of these material indicators, right? The gains are largely symbolic and superficial. It's prominent people in positions of power. It's greater diversity and representation of popular media, but we're still seeing the huge gaps that we've seen all throughout. So I thought that was important to note too. In what ways can we try to unpack pieces of the narrative that are unspoken? And so I think that's, and of course we continue to go at it. But I think kind of we can model the challenge of thinking through and feeling a way through this as well. And I think that can empower students to be maybe more open and honest so that even our analysis can, I think, be a bit more richer.
So you've all gotten at some of these issues already, but one of the things that I really appreciate is, and somewhat expected, is that all of you are directly addressing this in the classroom and naming it for what it is. And for some faculty, they might be nervous about doing so, or have some challenges or fears about what that process could look like, as well as some of the ones that you all have mentioned about this happening so early, not having that community and that kind of classroom space already developed. So I'm curious, what concerns did you have about teaching this event, if any at all, and what strategies then did you take, or have you taken maybe in the past, in trying to address these issues as well too? Ashley, do you want to start us for this?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So I think one of the really hard things is that our students often have really different understandings of race and politics than we do as instructors. And they often come to our classes with deeply convicted attitudes and opinions and beliefs about these topics. Many of them are formed by their personal identities and experiences. So for me, teaching about topics that are challenging and controversial requires that I have to acknowledge that, and I have to meet students where they are. So I have what I think of as like 3 broad strategies that I use in my classes. And I want to say that this is, I think, what works for me, but I am very much still learning myself how to do this and how to do this well. So I certainly wouldn't consider anything I say the final word on this matter. But the first strategy is one that Davin mentioned a minute ago, which is that I pull back the curtain and I remind my students to consider the context of their class, their professor, the academic research that we're talking about, and politics. I remind them that nothing happens in a vacuum, including their own experience in my course. And I think one of the most important things I do in the service of this strategy is I acknowledge how my own identity likely interacts with their classroom experience. Now, I mentioned immediately, I make it very upfront that I am a white person teaching about race and racism, and that I don't have the lived experience of racism or prejudice that some of my colleagues might have, that some of my students of color might experience. And I also talk about what that means in terms of my authority and the authority that different students may or may not unconsciously imbue my instruction with as a result. And I remind my students of color that some of the discussions might be hard for them in a way that isn't necessarily the case for white students. And I tell them they don't need to feel like it's their job to do the emotional labor of educating their classmates. And I say that it's not their job to be representatives of their race, and sharing their experiences is up to them. My second strategy is one that I think that at least Davin and Andrea will probably be familiar with, because I borrow this from my advisor and their advisor, Vince Hutchings, which is my class is like completely run by this idea that we are here to discuss ideas and not people. So I ruthlessly police class discussion. And that's because it's essential that all of my students feel comfortable engaging in the subject matter, regardless of their views. And that includes the ability to express attitudes or beliefs, or to ask questions that might be problematic or might be controversial, because students have those attitudes and those beliefs, and my ability to teach them something requires that they have the ability to share those attitudes and beliefs. But when I respond to things, and I never let anything that is an opinion that's not consistent with facts about the world hang out there unaddressed. But when I respond, I always do so in a way that is completely calm. I never act fazed by anything. I acknowledge what students say. I don't blame them. I don't shame them, but I am also very honest about the realities of race and racism and the racist history of the United States, and how these elements undergird contemporary politics. And then the last strategy I use is that I use my role as a social scientist to my advantage. So I teach my students about the scientific method, the research process. I make it clear to them that what we know about race and politics and contemporary events, that this is the product of a scientific process where evidence is marshaled and it's evaluated. And this isn't a crutch. This is, I think, the most powerful tool we have in our toolbox as social scientists and teachers, because it helps our students, I think, respect and understand our expertise. And it lets them know that the things that I have to tell them in class are not my personal casual experiences or observations about the world, that they are a product of the science, and the science that comes through, comes via a rigorous process. And so part of what we do is we talk about how do you evaluate evidence, and how do we know what is good evidence and what's not. And I think that this approach adds a really important sense of legitimacy and objectivity to the material that I think makes students far more receptive to learning. And I'll pass it over to Davin.
Yeah, thank you, Ernestine. I'm still ruminating with what you said. I really like how you really hit two key points, right? Which is kind of being authentic about your identity and what you do and do not have to filter your experiences, and also being really hewing to what we know, right? And kind of not hemming and hedging on that when people, as you give them free license to do, speak on their opinion perspective, you weigh it against the reality. I like that a lot. I mean, I also think about how I bring my identities into the space and how those identities are quite obvious to the classroom. And I think that's something that I've grown and developed and continue to grow in my teaching. So this is my first year as a tenured professor, but I think long before I actually hit tenure, I reached a certain level of comfort and, dare I say, boldness about, and the boldness was really just kind of acknowledging the fit between what I am and what people perceive me to be. I remember like my first time teaching my media course, it was during the primary season for the 2016 election. And I really was mum on who I was supporting in the primary or who I was leaning towards when I was asked directly. And a few weeks later, I was like, I'm not entirely sure why I was so cautious. Like, you probably have pretty strong assumptions about who I am and am not supporting. And I don't know why we can't just acknowledge that, right? It doesn't make anything any less clear, right? So like, that's when I started realizing, let me acknowledge the assumptions that they bring to the space when they see me in front of the classroom. Especially if those assumptions aren't always false, right? So I think for me, that is part of pulling back the curtain, when I can take off the professor hat and be like, this is actually Davin talking as a Black man in America hat right now. I think, let me just illuminate this experience. And like, I'm always trying to be very, this is what happens when you're in week 5 already, intentional about letting them know when I speak honestly from my experiences, this isn't like, and this is what you have to take away from the course. This is just because I think there's a power in narrative. And I think there's a power in storytelling that carries a great deal of pedagogical weight, not just for you to listen idly to my story, but you can understand how to tell your story in a way that connects it to the big picture ideas, regardless of how you are affected, whether you are privileged or marginalized within the story that we're trying to tell. So I think that's paid some dividends. I also have to recognize, right? It's quite significant when I have people tell me, you're my first Black professor. I've been here 4 years, And I don't want to lose that, right? I don't want to kind of eschew the potential value of someone having someone that they haven't had occupy these identities in front of the classroom before. And that requires me to have a level of authenticity and to recognize that there is a pursuit of objective truth we're seeking together, but also that this truth is filtered through the lenses that we carry. So I'm going to give you a recognition of my filter, and I'm going to push you and interrogate you to think about the filters that you're applying to this situation. And we're going to not only try to interrogate how we're processing these through our filters, but also put ourselves in the shoes of others. And so I think that takes me back to, who are we centering within the narratives we're telling? And so I think when I was teaching on the Capitol siege, I really wanted to make sure we weren't just looking to analyze the people that stormed that Capitol, because they get a lot of that. We've seen a lot of analyses and interrogations of that set of people. And what I haven't seen in the broader discursive space are analyses of the people that are at the brunt of those actions, the people that have been at the mercy of these policies that have been acted. And those are the people that are in my classroom, right? It's the folks that are first and second gen immigrants, right? It's first generation college folks and community college transfers, right? People from bilingual households. I want them to be seen and felt and heard. So even in kind of creating the syllabus and highlighting different scholars, including people on this Zoom call, letting them know a lot of this work that we're drawing from actually comes from people from your communities. Some things comes from people that sat in this seat maybe at Irvine, right? I think that's important too, to help them understand that people from their communities have played a part in creating and cultivating this truth that we're trying to establish. And so it's a lot, and I want to recognize that it's a lot. And I also recognize that as a man that's evaluated differently, and I try to be explicit about this too, I have license to maybe be treated accordingly that my women colleagues do not have. And I try to get them to interrogate that as well. How would you be responding if a woman took some time to speak honestly from her experiences in this moment? Keep that in mind for evaluations, right? In a few weeks. So I think the way I navigate my identities has continued to be work in progress, but it's something that I've become more comfortable kind of leading with, because I recognize it's pretty undeniable, particularly given how far I fit from the prototypical professor. But how can I leverage that to be another tool for connecting with students so we can kind of get some, just go a little deeper. So with that, I'll give it to Andrea Silva.
Thank you so much. I really love what you said about looking for an original truth, but filtering it through our own. I thought that's so hot. Sorry, I thought that was so great. So what do I do? I think Davin really highlights one of the pitfalls of being an assistant professor is that at the beginning you really want to hedge, right? You don't want to make a point of saying like, this is not good, right? But now with, as a seasoned late assistant professor, right? I feel more confident in saying like, this was not a good thing. This is wrong. This is inconsistent with our democratic values, right? And there's no kind of like devil's advocate here, right? And so I think that's something that is important to highlight, right? Like there is no room for, oh, what if, or oh, maybe, like, no, there is no room for that, right? And I also kind of, I suppose this is not good to say, but like, I really do mock them by highlighting the inconsistencies in what they're talking about and discussing. And I think that that's actually really important. One, because like, I don't know about anybody else, but like, I really try and, the way that I cope with things is humor. And so using that to highlight the inconsistencies, right? If the Republican Party is ideologically consistent, they can't be the party of Lincoln and the party of the Confederacy, right? It's like just kind of highlighting those inconsistencies. I also, I say it, right? Like I think I am a first generation, lower middle class. My parents are immigrants. Like my brother and I were the first in our family to go to college. I think I'm like the first Silva of like any Silvas that ever Silvaed to get a PhD. And so I take that my students of color in my class, I take that burden on for them. And I say the things that I know they're thinking and that they tell me after class that they have been thinking all along, but nobody said it out loud. So I take that burden on for my students of color. I also worry about white students, right? Students that self-identify as white, and I make it really explicit. Like, I know in some cases, white students think that by highlighting all of these histories, that it's like some kind of like white hating thing, right? And so I really make it clear in my class for students that like, this is not an exercise in shaming. This is an exercise in letting you know what has been done in your name, right? And so if you accept these things that have been done in your name, then okay. But if you do not, this is a point for you to create some kind of change, right? You did not know, that's fair. I mean, that's why you're here at school, like you're learning, right? That's the whole point of this, right? But now that you know, what are you gonna do about it, right? And so I talk a lot about not being, you don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree, but you can't ignore what's happening, right? You can't say that you didn't know or you weren't sure, right? Now you know. And so what are you going to do about it, right? The other thing that is part of my discussion here is, I am a white presenting Latina, right? And I'm in a position of power in a classroom in a HSI, right? A Hispanic Serving Institution. And so I really do take that opportunity to identify how anti-Black Latinos can be as a culture, right? And so, and how we as Latinos and Latinx need to think about the types of politics and socialization that we talk about, right? I mean, like the leader of the Proud Boys, he's a Latino, he's Cuban, right? And so I take this opportunity to talk to Latinos and Latinx kids and let them know that Latinos are not, that white presenting Latinos can be racist, that we are not outside of, that we can perpetuate white supremacy, that we can perpetuate and support white supremacy. I mean, look at example, right? And that we need to be more thoughtful about how Latinos and Latinx people enter into these spaces, right? Yeah, so I think that's kind of that's the thing that I really push on, right? Because I have a lot of Latino kids in my Latino politics, in immigration, right? And there's always a lot of kids in the intro class. And so I always say, yes, Latinos can be racist. And because we're white adjacent, presenting Latinos are white adjacent, we perpetuate white supremacy. And there were a bunch of Latinos at the insurrection. So don't pretend, like, we are privileged and not privileged, right? And so you need to interrogate that. And I'm happy, and I talk to students about that a lot. Okay, I'm gonna tag my tocaya. Do you know what tocaya is, Andrea? Have you ever heard that? It means somebody that has your same name. You're my tocaya.
Context cues and get in it. I won't say too much because honestly, y'all have really covered it. I'll say the last thing is, one, for me, even as much as I didn't want to do it on the first day, I thought to myself, if I don't, my students of color will think I agree with what happened and that they don't have a space. And so it was really important for me, as hard as it was, I was like, oh, not the first day. We don't even know each other. Oh, this is so hard. But I really wanted to give them that space. And so I think I do a little bit of what everyone does here. And the last thing I'll say that's really important to me, just because I really want to get to the audience's questions, but I think building off what everyone said, I do want my students to be really strong in their social science. And so the one thing I say to them is, I have no intention of changing your mind, but I will bring data to bear on things that you say and things that we talk about. And I hope that you will learn to be more critical, to use data and be analytical in the way that you assess things. And so my former students always make fun of me and they claim that my child's first words will be, what did the data say? And I think that's pretty accurate. So I think that's, I don't want to take too much time, but I do a lot of what everyone else does. But again, it was really important to me that my students of color knew, hey, we're going to talk about tough things. We're going to do it this particular way. But yeah, that was messed up. And we have to address it head on, because I felt like if I was silent, I was endorsing it and saying, like, who cares that happened? It's just another day in Washington. So I really did want to address it head on, even though I knew it was hard. And the last thing I'll say is, much like Davin and Andrea said, I take it very seriously when my students tell me, you're my first Black female professor, or you're my first Black professor. And so I do try to use my power as best as possible to advocate for them, to say the hard things. But I also just want them to know that I'm approachable. And so sometimes they want to talk to me about things that maybe they were shy in class. And so I hope that they know that they can set up an office hours and, we can just chat about those things, because I also understand that not every student, especially on the first day, is going to be really willing to go in. And so how do I still create a space that they can come and grapple with the tough topics, even if they're not ready to do it publicly in front of the whole class?
Thanks, everybody. So we're getting some questions in from the audience, which is great. And I encourage other audience members to add if you have specific questions and we'll try to get to as many of these as we can by maybe not going to everyone, but just if one or two of you want to take this question on and answer it. The first is, a number of you have mentioned the challenge of this coming early in the semester, but not necessarily mentioned the additional challenge of the pandemic moving a lot of us online, or having the requirement of now being recorded. In the spring, I got some threats about posting my lectures online and recording them, and so stopped doing so. And so we have a question from the audience about, how do you handle whether to record and post those Zoom meetings when you are trying to have these important conversations with your students?
I'll just jump in because I spent a lot of time, like class was live, we met synchronously, and I just recorded it and posted it. And I was like, hey, if y'all have to miss class because of COVID, just watch the video. So when I went back to go look at my plays, it was so low. No one was going to watch these videos that I made. So this semester, I was just like, hey, y'all, this is a class that's being offered online. It is not an online class. We meet at this time. It's mandatory. Please come to class. And if you miss class, contact one of your friends. You can come to office hours. I just decided, and you're right, I do think there were moments last semester where even I stopped students because I was like, hey, just a reminder, this is being recorded. Because then I don't know what, if even another classmate has access to it, I didn't know what was going to happen to it. So, that was a tough decision, but I did decide this semester I'm not recording, just because I did wonder if it made some students censor themselves in any direction really, but also that it was sort of hard for me as the facilitator and the manager of the class to sort of, students want to talk like they always do, oh, this thing. And I really had to cut people off and say, hey, let's think about that. Or if you want to hold that comment until I'm done with, we're done, I can, you can talk about it after I hit, stop the recording. And so I do think that's just a challenge of COVID. And I don't know if my other panelists have better suggestions, but like I said, this semester I decided not to record.
I'll just say super quick. I did want to raise, I think the fact that we're in COVID really is critical, even beyond the recording question. Like, I think a lot of our students don't get the value or the pleasure of having the particular spaces they have on campus to process these. And many of them might be in family situations, which are the opposite of healthy avenues and spaces to process, which makes it even more of a incumbent, maybe burden on us as professors to have help to create that space. And just recording, I think you do have to do the decision that is safest for you and think about the ways in which you can create forums. I think Andrea is speaking to this, right? In which they can be honest without it heavily creating blowback. So I know for me, the recordings is not necessarily an issue because it's not really sensitive things that have come up or that they're like regretting saying on record. But I know those chats, which there's no record of them. Sometimes I'll just peek in the chat where it's not related to something I'm saying, like, wow, y'all are really comfortable in these chats. Wow. Okay. So I think we can be mindful of the spaces we can create for them to have completely safe, unfettered license to speak honestly and authentically, while still creating something that's maybe recorded for posterity for people that can miss the class. But I do recognize that. I want to acknowledge, you do have to place your students' safety first, just like Andrew's doing, deciding not to record in this instance.
Yeah, I have two things that I want to add to these great points. The first is kind of on a different note, which is that in a normal classroom environment, I don't let my students have their laptops out, and I don't let them take pictures of my lectures or my slides, which is something students, I think, often like to do because they think they can take out their phone and take a photo of the slide rather than having to write things down. And I actually do that. I don't let them do it because I am sensitive to like the kinds of things that happen on like Campus Reform and other right-wing websites where professors teaching about race and racism and topics like white privilege kind of end up on these websites. And I have not had that happen by way of any of my students. I've had it happen to me, but not because of my students. But I have a conversation about this with them. And I say, I don't want this stuff to be recorded and distributed. Now, I can't do that at this point in time because of COVID and because my university requires that I provide an asynchronous option. So I record my lectures, but in order to make sure my students feel like they have a safe space, what I have done this past semester is I created a Slack channel where my students were required to participate as part of their grade. And so I'd never done this before, and it actually worked out. Like, it was incredible. They had really amazing, meaningful conversations, and I got a lot of feedback from at the end of my course about the Slack discussions. And my students said that it was like some of the most valuable, kind of meaningful, important, thoughtful conversations that they'd ever had in a classroom. And so I actually think after COVID, I'll go back to having this kind of Slack discussion in addition to having the sort of normal in-class conversations.
Another question that we've gotten from the audience and in trying to combine a couple of the questions is what advice, all of you are experts on racial and ethnic politics, and so your level of comfort on speaking on these issues might be a little higher than the typical political scientist, right? Where the discipline has marginalized these issues and topics. And so for someone who's a generalist or not an expert in these areas, what advice would you give? What resources, readings would you suggest for them to try to enter into the space to host, if they want to host these conversations with the students?
I'll just start here. My go-to reading is always Invisible Knapsack, right? I don't know if you know that one. I forgot. Who was the author? What is her name?
Peggy McIntosh.
Thank you, Peggy McIntosh. It's a super easy, super quick reading. And then I pair it with an exercise, right? Where I take all the students outside. I put them into 3 different groups, and I tell them they're going to do a team building exercise where, you know, like the floor is lava, but the only thing they can step on are pieces of paper. I give each of the groups a different amount of paper. So some groups get all the paper, some groups get medium amount, and some groups get like less, like 2 less than they are. Usually they never notice, right? But the few students that do notice, I always kind of put you guys all have the same amount of paper. I don't know why you're complaining, right? Like that. That helps with a later discussion about privilege. Do we notice privilege? What does that look like? How did you feel? Did you even notice, right? And it kind of opens up the idea of talking about a lot of different kinds of privilege, right? Not white privilege and white supremacy, right, is a really important thing to discuss. And, you know, there's class privilege, right, that we don't really talk about, or we use race as a proxy for class. I talk about my own privileges, right, as someone that's like white presenting. I have a PhD. I don't have an accent, right? I don't speak with an accent. Like, these are all privileges that I enjoy. And kind of, it's like a bottom up kind of thing, right? And it really helps students ease into this discussion without talking about like, you know, without being like too, it helps them kind of investigate their own privileges and what they do, instead of like a top down approach, like read it from a book.
I'll just jump in really quickly because I think we're living through a really great time. And I usually, when I think things are tough, and I would say for other people, is, you know, use the internet, right? So I think Monkey Cage has been such a valuable resource because they make it's so hard to get it out. But it has links in it to the things we've talked about. So you'll get the real social science research in there, although it's been condensed and is palatable to everyone. But then you can sort of decide, you know, oh, I like this post piece, and it's, you know, it's making these points. And then if you want to send them the research that's linked in there, you can, and then they can see, oh my gosh, this is real social science, and this is the way my colleagues are talking about this topic. And so that way it meets them where they are, because I think it is accessible, it's easy language, there's nothing jargony in it. But then if you as a professor want to say, you know, I want us also to discuss this with this is where the data came from, we can do that together. And then that leads it, I think that makes the students feel a little bit more comfortable, because it wasn't a bunch of regression results and statistics. It's just real English, you know, to the extent that everyone's competent in that, right? It's just regular language that they can sort of filter, and then they feel like, oh, I understood that social science that you've been talking about.
I want to give a quick shout out, to this book. I can put this in the chat, but this is actually a really great book, and it's written by a social psychologist who studies and teaches on race and racism, and a lot of the strategies use evidence-based teaching tools. So I think if you're totally new to this, it's a great resource.
Can you tell us the title and the author, just so everyone has it?
Yeah, it's Teaching About Race and Racism in the College Classroom, and it's written by Cindy Kernahan.
Another question that we're getting from the chat, I'm going to try to pair them together so that we can get to both of them, but that we have seen perhaps a little more explicitly recently, at least, that this kind of democratic erosion has become aligned with partisanship. And so for how do you navigate that for students perhaps that are Republican, as well as more broadly for students that are just resistant to these topics and may explicitly challenge you in class? How have you dealt with that? How do you deal with that in the classroom?
I can, oh, go ahead, Devin.
No, you should. All right. I'm sure you should get more kind of resistance than I do, so you should start.
So just a couple of things really quickly. One is that I think that it's really important to make clear to our students that in a lot of instances and for a lot of these topics, there aren't two sides, right? I mean, sometimes there are two perspectives, but there aren't two sides, for example, to like the legacy and the current experience of people of color in the United States and race and racism. And so I think that partisanship leads people to sort of believe that there are two sides. And I think, again, it's important to use the tools of social science and the research that we have to show like that's just simply not the case. I think in terms of resistance, so for me, again, it's really important that my students feel like they can say what they want to say. So I respond, I'm always really respectful to my students, but I make sure that I offer them the correct narrative based on what we know, based on research. And I think that, you know, there's sort of I think, inclination among a lot of us. We really want to persuade our students to have a different perspective. And I think that part of what we have to do is kind of step back from that goal. Like our job isn't to kind of indoctrinate our students. It's to tell them what we know about the world. And I think providing like and fielding kind of the resistance requires both being kind of unfazed by it, and doing that honestly requires a lot of practice. So if you look at how I responded to my students my first semester teaching and how I do it now, a lot of it is just a result of like, basically I've heard everything at this point and I have practiced responding to almost everything. And so it just comes by way of experience. And I think that, you know, the other thing is just like relying on the academic work to speak to their responses. That's a really important part of it.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, I kind of work through that by making clear in my race classes, I'm centering the perspectives and experiences and voices of people of color. And so from people of color's perspective, one party's policies and practices and one former president's policies and practices have been viewed as an unmitigated disaster, right? And if I get pushback against that, it's like, this is their experiences. Here are perfect many examples, not just from scholarship, but from popular media and from people that have platforms to talk about the actual harm caused by these actions and policies. The other way I try to mitigate that is, look, I'm not going to simply criticize Republicans. From the perspective of people of color, there's plenty of blame for Democrats as well. So I think people come away thinking that I'm anti-parties at the end, which means I don't have the partisan bias. But I laugh, but I'm serious about that, right? When we're centering people of color, there's plenty of critique to go around, very strong critique. And I think the other thing is there's a difference between maybe offering points that might make people from a certain perspective wrong and stifling them. So what Ashley said is so important. We don't have to prevent people from speaking. That doesn't mean we can't contest and counter. I actually have had far right students in my classroom, and one in particular that was particularly vocal. I did appreciate that he did recognize how much of a distance his views were from others, and so he wouldn't push buttons unnecessarily. But reading his work and engaging him was certainly a challenge for me, but it was something I knew I had to do because my responsibility to him was as equivalent to my responsibility to everyone else. And at the end of the day, I know because he let me know that he respected that he could be in this space that he would have thought was this incredibly hostile space. And intellectually, in terms of ideas, maybe it was, but he knew that we were going to have an exchange of ideas and we weren't going to maybe hold fast. But I think it's possible, right? It's possible, but also, I also couldn't kind of be so hindered by falling prey to some of these rhetorical trappings we use. You can counter without stifling. And if they're working in good faith, operating in good faith, they won't treat the countering as stifling. Or if they do, you know they're not good faith actors and you don't need to. Obviously, there's pressures and maybe they can sink your student evals and that can really matter for you where your position is. And that's terrible. But that's not on you. That's on us as an academic entity to not allow that kind of bad faith practice to sink your career, right? So I don't know if you want to get into those structural conversations with 6 minutes left, we probably don't, but this is something we have to consider, right? As like, what kinds of practices are we rewarding and not rewarding? And in what ways are we empowering or making more vulnerable the teachers that can be so impactful for the students that haven't had much space in all of history?
One question we've gotten is about the format of classes. And so for those instructors who are teaching more lecture style versus discussion, how do you approach this issue for those of you who teach the larger classes?
I guess I should. Good. Yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, go. I teach a 200-person Intro to American Politics class. And during the pandemic, I've been teaching in person. I record my lectures on Panopto. I don't ever show students' faces. I point the camera directly to me. And so students in that way are somewhat shielded from, whatever from being on the recording as much as possible. I say it. And then there's so much power in saying it, right? I think it's important. I think it's important to repeat kind of what Ashley and Davin are saying in their previous answer that, there's a lot of good hate. You can hate on both parties, right? And there's no, I think students come with like a chip on their shoulder that like, my class is going to be like some kind of like radical communist left-wing indoctrination, right? And when they show up, I try to be really disarming with my charm and my humor, right? And I think setting that that idea with students is really important, right? So I don't take myself too seriously, and I think that brings students' guard down a lot. I do get upset when students are not paying attention, right? But I just say it. And I don't say it in a preachy way. It's like literally, like Ashley said, there are facts. These are truths, right? That have been investigated through our social science that are pretty undeniable. And so when students come up with these questions, as they always do, you interrogate it, you talk about it, you ask them questions, and it leads them to a conclusion, right? Liberal students too. Liberal students also have a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes that are not true, right? And so my goal here is to interrogate students about their preconceived notions to come to where they're coming from, right? I'm not on any side. Like, I don't like Democrats and I don't like Republicans, right? Liberals have problems, conservatives too. Where are you coming from and why does that matter?
Well, I want to end here, and unfortunately can't get to every question from the audience, but want to be respectful of everyone's times and thank each of you. Our panelists very quickly responded to email, text message, DM, asking them to join us and put this together in a very quick time and give of their energy and expertise. And so I really honor and respect that and want to thank you all for this and hopefully just beginning a conversation in political science of where we really reckon with what's our role in this history as the discipline, in our scholarship, as well as in our classrooms. And really appreciate the directness and you all sharing everything that you bring to the classroom. So thank you all.